Rutgers football back in action on Saturday night, 6 p.m. at Maryland. Huge Big Ten contest for both teams. The Scarlet Knights looking to build off of last weekend's win over Minnesota. Back to talk Rutgers football. David Anderson, always a pleasure to have you here. Thanks so much for being back. And just initially, your thoughts on that big win over Minnesota last week.
Well, thanks for having me. I know it's been a long couple weeks for us. I guess the main takeaway from the Minnesota game, I would say, is that Rutgers defensively did what other teams, including Maryland, were not able to do against Minnesota, which is really force Max Brosmer to make throws he didn't want to make. And so when you look at him, I don't know what his listed height is, but you could tell he couldn't really see over the middle particularly well. And Rutgers kind of forced a lot of those passes to the outside, or if passes were over the middle, they really plugged the like viewing lanes of Brosmer, which is not going to probably be as effective against Maryland, but it could work somewhat. The other thing about the Minnesota game is we talk about try to win the game by 10 points. Don't just try to win by 1. Mm-hmm. And I do think Rutgers, they got a little lucky with the turnover late in the fourth quarter. Was kind of earlier in the fourth quarter, but late in the game. But for all intents and purposes, they were up by 2 scores, which forced Minnesota to have to kick that field goal. Whereas if you're only up by 7, then a touchdown ties the game. Mm-hmm. And so that was a huge moment. It almost was more like an NFL type game where a team is ahead. You're kind of trading points for time. And if you're up by enough, then you don't have to worry about just like one pass interference call or something like that. I would say that those are some of my main takeaways. And just Rutgers just wanted it more. And I don't know if we can say that. I think they tried pretty hard against USC, though that game kind of went as I expected. But it was clear in the game against Minnesota that Rutgers wanted it more. When receivers had the ball and maybe a guy wasn't securing it right away, they were there knocking it away. Tackling, they were gang tackling. It was not like some of the, other games, especially we've seen in the NFL over the last few weeks, where like guys just do not want to tackle. And so if you want to beat Maryland, you're going to have to tackle because they're going to complete a lot of passes, especially over the middle, and you got to keep those. Maybe it's a 7-yard gain. You can't let them get a first down. Maryland is very reliant on like 3rd and long completions sometimes. But if you do the tackling you did against Minnesota, which is almost perfect, you're going to give yourself a chance to win this game. So those are some of my initial takeaways. And the last thing I'll just say is it didn't look good early. I mean, Minnesota went right down the field on the first drive, and I'm sure I texted you and everyone like, that did not look good. And I don't know what happened. Sometimes teams just have their good first drive in the first half and second half. I mean, I think that was what happened with Minnesota. Their 2 touchdown drives were the first drive of each half. Mm-hmm. And so it's a little bit more forgivable because, they've got a solid plan and good offense or great offense beats even good defense. So I guess that's, probably reason for optimism is that other than those first drives, Minnesota was kept out of the end zone.
Yeah, and I think what was key in that first half was Calic Manis's response to that first touchdown by Minnesota. Really got the offense going. He was sharp very early on. Obviously, third quarter, Rutgers offense did struggle, and the defense stepped up in that fourth quarter. Talking about Maryland now, obviously, they've dominated Rutgers the last couple of years. Last year, getting out to a huge lead through the air. Picking up where they left off this year with Edwards at quarterback, the only offense in the Big Ten averaging over 300 yards passing per game. And in Big Ten play, they lead the Big Ten with 290 yards passing yards per game. They obviously have 2 big-time receivers as well on this team. Ty Felton leading the Big Ten in receiving right now. I guess, what is your thoughts? Is this going to be more like obviously Minnesota more suitable to Rutgers style, similar, and Rutgers typically does well against those types of teams. Maryland feels more like UCLA, USC, just in terms of speed receivers, slants, short passes, looking to get yards after the catch. What are your thoughts in terms of how Rutgers defense could fare in this game on Saturday?
If Maryland is hot passing the ball, they're going to win. That's the short of it. That said, clearly they haven't been hot in every game because they're 4-5. Though you could probably throw the Oregon game away because there was just no way they were beating Oregon. If you look at that game, they were moving the ball in the first quarter, and then they had a lead early. Then things started to break down when Edwards had a fumble. He can occasionally be a little bit loose with the ball. Occasionally, he plays with a lot of confidence, and sometimes it's can be overconfident, I would say. But his fumble was returned for a touchdown, and then Oregon had two other. One was a turnover where Edwards threw it, hit right off a receiver's chest, right into the DB. They got the ball at the 4-yard line. They scored, and then late in the game, Maryland threw another. I think it was an interception, setting up another short field when it was already pretty much over, and they had to sell out to try to stop the run, and they got beat. So I think the Oregon final score was 39-18, but when you look at it, I mean, Oregon scored a defensive touchdown and 2 touchdowns on extremely short fields. So I'm not saying that Maryland wins that game, but that was not a complete shellacking like a lot of people in the media, especially, thought. So you can't take this team lightly. They did move the ball against Oregon, but the reason they lost, other than those turnovers, was that Oregon just has some guys that are just so elite. Like we talk about Maryland having some good athletes, but Oregon has some just like top level athletes like that. We've only seen a couple of them at Rutgers in the last 25 years, and they had like 5 guys that were doing that on that game. So I think Edwards. The other thing, if you want to talk about their game against Minnesota, that was probably the best quarterback game I'd ever seen where a team was down 31-3. Like hitting slants, curls, guys dropped a couple balls. He was just very good with his reads. And it was, again, turnovers that undid Maryland in that game. And then I do think that they're a little bit of an emotional team, and there was a little bit of lack of effort on Maryland's part in that fourth quarter. I did not see that against Oregon. I think they cleaned a lot of that up. So Edwards, again, he reads his progressions really well. Like the best thing to say about the entire Maryland team is if you take Rutgers from last year and do the complete inverse of that, that's Maryland. Their quarterback goes through his progressions well. They prefer throwing the ball. They complete a lot of third and longs through the air. You have to get pressure on him, or else he'll carve you up. So that's my main thing with Edwards. I've been very impressed. I didn't think he would be this good. And so the one thing you got to do is get pressure. So let me talk about their offensive line, I guess, next, because their offensive line, they're very big. I mean, I think Shiano used the word gigantic or mammoth in the press conference. They're big, but they can be susceptible to either speed rushes coming from the outside, or they're sometimes a little quick to double team. So if you run like a stunt or a delayed blitz, sometimes the 2 guys are engaged with one defender and he has like a free lane right to the quarterback. But the other thing you got to do and take that with a grain of salt is Edwards is very good at seeing those lanes and using it as a viewing lane into where his receiver is going to be. And I've seen him adjust his progression to throw through a lane that he can see, which is something that Brosmer did not do last week. So is that because Rutgers didn't allow it, or is that because just a good defense? I don't know. So there are some things there, but Maryland's offense, especially their passing attack, is very able to adjust and counterpunch to whatever you're doing on defense. And that's even without talking about their receivers.
Yeah, Maryland's been, it's a weird season for them. They've lost 4 out of their last 5. And what I think is interesting about this matchup for them, you speak about they play better against Oregon. It makes sense. They were on a bye the week before. Be interesting to see, they played Saturday night last week. They come back from the West Coast. And then you're looking after Rutgers. They have Iowa and then at Penn State. This team is 4-5. I think it's going to be very interesting to see your point in against the Minnesota game where they kind of gave up in the end. If Rutgers can jump out to a lead in this game and then kind of defeat their will a little bit, Maryland is staring at a losing season and not making a bowl if they lose to Rutgers. So their last hope is to win this game. So it's going to be very interesting just in terms of, the toughness. If Rutgers can display toughness, punch them in the mouth early, grab a lead, I think it's going to be mentality-wise very interesting to watch how Maryland responds in this game. just in terms of the Rutgers offense, what they were able to do against Minnesota, how do you feel they match up against this Maryland defense?
I think they match up pretty well. And so that's why some people are talking it might be a shootout. I feel like every time we've ever predicted a shootout, it's never happened, and vice versa. We're predicting 13-10 against UCLA, and then that game's in the 30s. Neither offense can be stopped at times. So, but the reason for that prediction is when you look at their defense, they also played a style that kind of dictates high-scoring games because people talk about their run defense being like bad. That's completely an oversimplification. When you watch early in the game, the Maryland defense maintains gap integrity really well. They flow really well. So if you run like just like a stretch play or even a toss to the outside, they lock that down pretty easily. Like everyone seems to stay in their lane and they sniff that out. Like it's not a good they're built to defeat zone blocking on the offense of the other team. And so running, I mean, it's not really Rutgers' bread and butter. So that's one of the reasons I feel confident because one of the things you have to do against their defense is you have to get them out of those pursuit lanes. Rutgers completely failed to do that against Wisconsin early. They kind of figured it out later. But even though Maryland plays with like a bigger front than Wisconsin, who only used like 2 down linemen, Maryland prefers going with 4, but they did go with 3 at times against Oregon. So you got to be ready for both fronts. But they will maintain their integrity. Like if you toss right, everyone kind of flows in that direction. And usually there's guys there to make the tackle. So it kind of forces you to pass the ball. But by playing that style of defense, it also makes them traditionally play read run first, and then drop in the pass coverage. And like we've seen Rutgers, when they don't have a solid quarterback option, even when Noah Vedrill's been banged up or in certain situations with Wimsett, this like crash the run, and then if it's a pass, just kind of drop back into an area is vulnerable to good passing attacks because they don't necessarily get a lot of turnovers defensively because much like we talked about Michigan State last year, their DBs kind of like hover around. They don't like to get too engaged. They don't like to draw penalties for pass interference like Minnesota did last week, but they'll let you complete the ball if you throw it accurately. If you don't throw it accurately, then they're primed for big hits, tip balls, and guys are not engaged. So it's very much easier for them to make interceptions if you're inaccurate with your ball. Like you have to throw the ball accurately. If you do, you're going to complete passes. If you don't, there's going to be interceptions. So that's why I feel like the Michigan State comparison last year is fairly accurate in terms of the way they play defense. And we saw that Rutgers did have success moving the ball like that when they were hot. Same thing against Maryland last year. When Rutgers was hot, I know they fell out to an early deficit, but they were scoring points as the game progressed. And so however they figured that out later in the game last year, they're going to have to come up with a way to do that again in this game.
Yeah, very good point. And obviously, we don't know if Kyle Monungai is going to return and play in this game. Was banged up prior to the USC game, then obviously took a couple hits helmet to helmet, did not play last week. Shiano citing not letting him play for his own good. What were your thoughts on Deshaun Benjamin, Antoine Raymond, combined for about 150 yards rushing? Obviously, Benjamin really came through with some big-time runs down the stretch of that game. Thoughts on how well Rutgers will be able to run against Maryland and how much you think that balance is going to be between run and pass game for the Rutgers offense?
Yeah, I think in this game you got to set up the run with the pass. And I was very pleased with what I saw from Benjamin because I kind of be talking about, and every week Rutgers just kind of figured this out a little bit more. If they run they ran 2 things differently last week more. Tempo, as in running up to the line and snapping the ball. One, Minnesota had to call timeout when Kelly McManus even snuck in that touchdown, which they then called timeout, and Rutgers had to come out and punch it in again. But that wasn't the only time that they did snap it earlier in the play clock. And so that was one. But then also the tempo of how long it takes a certain play to develop. Minnesota was pathetic in terms of their preparation for certain things. They just expected Rutgers going to run what they run, and including the 4 wide receiver thing, where I'm like, okay, so PJ Fleck, you are less knowledgeable about how your team that you coached with Kirk Ciarrocca in 2019 ran their offense than I am. I watched more film about Kirk Ciarrocca when he has no tight end than you did. Like, that was just a pathetic excuse that I think he either gave in the press conference or it was another interview he did where he said they weren't prepared for the 4 receiver sets. I think that if you run 4 receiver sets, that may be more useful to a back like Benjamin, because he will succeed if you can adjust the timing of the route. Like, sometimes he was getting the ball quick, sometimes he was bouncing outside quick, sometimes he was making a cut before a hole was open. Like, it was just a little bit more, it was a little more helter-skelter, but it worked out because the defense was kind of in read and react mode. And that's my fear if, let's say, Monangai can play and you go back to him and Raymond. Raymond runs a very similar style to Monangai in terms of how he waits for his blocks, how he will engage a defender. So whereas Benjamin, there was a couple times he put his head down, but there was a couple times where he kind of faked it and then juked or like did like a sidestep, and the defender wasn't ready for it, and he actually broke a few tackles late. I don't know if that would work early when the defense is fresh, but when they were a little bit worn down, it was extremely effective on those final drives, which were, kind of to your point, really important in terms of icing that game, because it set up Rutgers for the field goal, and it also, more importantly, killed a lot of clock that they were able to move down the field after the safety and then subsequently on their other drive. So I think I like Raymond. I really do. But if Monangai can play, I really think you have to mix it up with both Benjamin and Monangai. That being said, you do have to trust Raymond a little bit more in pass protection. He did one of the best jobs I've ever seen a true freshman do in pass protection. Mind you, a true freshman who should be in high school right now. So there might be reasons you're hesitant to use Benjamin, but especially if you do have a lead or it's close and you're not just forced to pass, I think Rutgers did do a good job of not panicking and passing too early. There have been games this year where they abandoned the run too early, and hopefully this is not one of those games as well. So I know I'm kind of rambling, but there's a lot to say about Benjamin in his first action that he's had this season. But he showed a lot of the same things we saw from him last year, which set the team up for success when he was kind of the change of pace to what Monangai was bringing to the table.
Yeah, great points. And I think what's encouraging is that you saw that the offense made real adjustments in that bye week, changing formations, changing personnel, and it gave them, they were more dynamic. And it almost looked like Calic Manis was more comfortable, more confident, playing a little bit more up tempo. And so we're not going to know about Monangai until the availability report comes out. Personally, I'm skeptical he's going to play. But we'll see. That's just a gut. That's no knowledge or anything like that. But I'm all in on Benjamin. Like you said, I think the fact that they gave him those carries too spoke to their confidence in him, the way he was, gaining momentum. It was Monangai-esque in the sense of how the offense was able to control that clock, get down, near the goal and get that extra score that you talked about in terms of making it a 2-score game was so critical. Kind of I feel like it's not even talked about enough, just in terms of obviously the big plays the defense did, but that was so key for them winning that game in terms of that drive where he had those 2 big runs that got them near the goal line, and then they kicked the field goal. Overall with this game, is there any kind of X factor or something you wanted to touch on that we haven't already?
Yeah, I guess receivers on both sides. So I guess we'll talk about Rutgers first, because that's what we've been talking about. Maryland's defense, because of, like I was saying, they kind of hover in the area of the receiver. If you throw those like high arcing, almost ducks, 50-50 balls, then they're going to then be engaged on your receiver, and they're going to knock more of those down and probably get less penalties than Minnesota just because of their style of play. But what they are susceptible to are, well, tight ends, which maybe Rutgers does not have that much of that position. Though we did see Logan Blake and Mike Higgins kind of look okay against USC, but they're more susceptible to your big receivers just using their frame, that if they catch the ball and then you're securing it quickly, that they don't have an ability to come in late and get the hand, because they're not engaged initially, right? So they're not hand fighting now. But once the ball comes to me, I've got to be strong and secure it. So that's where I think this is definitely more of a game for Strong or Duff to catch slants or passes like that, rather than those high arcing ones that we've seen the last couple of weeks. And then if you do go to someone like a Chris Long or a Dymere Miller, they got to catch the ball quick, because these defensive backs and linebackers are pretty strong, and they're going to rip it out. So, Chris Long has seemed to have lost some timeshare to Dremel, Duff. We haven't seen much of Ben Black lately comparatively because the other guys seem to be playing well. So that's definitely what I see from the Rutgers receivers is they're going to have to secure the ball quickly, and we're not going to see as many of those jump balls that they do well. So can Kelly McManus adjust? Probably. But I don't expect they're going to be able to just throw those like 50-yard passes and then either draw a flag or kind of make a catch and run like they did last week so effectively. That's one. On the flip side, the X factor is the Maryland receivers, because I should say it's more the matchup between the Rutgers DBs and the Maryland receivers, because Rutgers defensive backs, when I look at why you're getting burned in the pass game, there's usually four kind of factors. The receivers are too big, they're too fast, they're too good, which would include route running and just being quick, or the quarterback's just on fire. And sometimes Edwards can be on fire. That just might happen. But the Maryland receivers rely a little bit more on the size or the speed. Now, Rutgers is going to have to figure out what corners and what coverages that they can use to not get burned by the speed that they did against USC and UCLA. Conversely, against Minnesota, they rely on their receivers being quick, making good cuts, and Rutgers was staying with those guys and preventing long yards after the catch. So I'm not sure if the success Rutgers had against Minnesota in this aspect of the game is going to carry over, because Minnesota's receivers, even Daniel Jackson, like he's good, but he relies on savvy and route running more than he relies on just being big or being fast. Rutgers has had more trouble when they weren't even close enough to make a tackle of a UCLA or USC receiver, especially if, the Jabome or even Powell. I mean, I love Tyrone Powell. He's an NFL player, but he can't guard a guy running a 4.3 like in open space. So that'll be interesting to see. And as much as Kaji Sanders had a pretty nice game last week, if he gets more snaps again, he's really going to have to make a lot of plays. If he's a safety valve in the back of that defense, he cannot let anyone get past him, or else this could get ugly quick, because Maryland's going to throw a lot of slants. And then if you can tackle them right away, so be it. But if they get yards after the catch, like this could get ugly, like we saw the game last year.
Yeah, agreed. And that's been the Achilles heel in the, previous games that you mentioned, UCLA, USC. One thing about talking about the Maryland pass defense, they are tied for fourth in the Big Ten with 9 interceptions this year. They don't get a ton of pass deflections, but they have been pretty successful.
Because they're not getting them off tips. They're getting them off poorly thrown balls, or just if you throw it too high and there's too much air time. That makes total sense statistically with what I was saying.
Yes, that's why I wanted to back that up. And then wanted to get your thoughts, too, just talking about the Rutgers defense. Jabome played his most complete, best game of the season against Minnesota, I thought. Just in terms of how much do you think that bye week was important, not only fundamentally for the defense, tackling-wise, but also just kind of for the younger players to sink in a little bit, understand the system a little bit better, watch film, and kind of see how they executed at a much higher level against Minnesota?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you want to talk specifically about Jabome, I think it was a combination of both. It was a combination of, I think he was well prepared for what he needed to do in that game. But also because, again, I think Max Brosmer is limited by, I don't think he's that short, but they have a really tall offensive line at Minnesota. He just doesn't throw as many of those passes over the middle. And so if a receiver is coming over the middle, usually there's only one. And so Jabome was able to trust his just read and react more than UCLA, where he's going to have to go get backs out of the backfield, or, receivers are crossing over the middle and he's not sure who he's taking or going, right? Because one thing that UCLA or other teams run in the air raid style, they run that crossing route. So if you're a linebacker, you're not sure, if you're not experienced, okay, do I need to take this guy or do I need to take this guy, right? Because I now have to communicate with the corner or safety on either side of me, and there's just a lot of chaos. And Minnesota just doesn't run their offense that way because their quarterback can't see that. So I think that part might not be sustainable. But simplifying his positioning and keeping him, a lot of the plays I saw, and I didn't rewatch it 2 or 3 times like I normally do, but it looked like he kind of had a more simple responsibility, and they were relying on the other guys, especially Powell, to have to do a lot of these other things, which if Maryland is smart, which their offense usually is, they're going to know, okay, now I might have Tyrone Powell in the deep slot covering somebody, and that might be an area to take advantage of him. But I don't think Rutgers has a choice. I think that they have to just rely on Powell's experience on those plays and just hope that Maryland doesn't hit one like USC did, where Powell was up against a 4-3, 4-4 running receiver. And yeah, he's a great player, but that's not what he does best. I think we talked about this preseason, what's best for the team versus what's best for the player. Right now, Tyreen Powell needs to do what's best for the team, not what's best for his NFL, prospect, unfortunately. So again, we talked about that preseason as being a big factor with Toure, but then he got injured. And there's some other guys, especially like Powell, who may be in that role right now. So I'm curious if Rutgers will go more 3-corner sets because one of the things that we did see was a reduction in the snaps for Igbinosun partially because Sanders has been playing pretty well. Loyal seems to be playing better. Dixon looked a lot healthier. Mm-hmm. But if you want to see situations where Salam or Masco or Eric Rogers seemed like he was playing early in that game, but not late. But I think you might trust Salam and Masco more than you have earlier in the year. So maybe we see more 3 cornerback or even dime looks. It's possible. So I think the long way of saying some of what they did was sustainable. Some of it was, matchup for Minnesota. So I'm hopeful that they can minimize the exposure or Maryland's coaching staff doesn't realize how to exploit it, like the other teams did earlier in the year.
Right. Yeah, no. And speaking of Powell, obviously, I mean, how important his leadership has been to this team. And he's certainly not 100%. And delivering that huge forced fumble against Minnesota really changed that game. So he is really the quarterback of that defense. And even if he's not 100%, just having him out there, especially I think this week with Maryland, with all the different things that they can do in the pass game, will be really key for this team. And I agree, Dixon looked a lot better in this game. Aaron Lewis is gutting it out. I mean, this team's really, they certainly benefited from the week off health-wise, but they're still not where they want to be. Just talking about needing to get pressure. Obviously, Keontae Hamilton and Shiano said this week he's been their most consistent player. And then also Jordan Walker, having some moments here. How big is it for, how much do you think Harris Simiak's going to roll the dice in terms of trying to get pressure versus, attacking those slants and not getting exposed on those quick hits?
If they can pressure like they did in the first half last week, they're not going to have to blitz that much. Because when I watched that in real time, I didn't notice it as much. But when I started watching just the first quarter, I was like, who is this team? That was not the blow up plays off the ball explosiveness that we've seen or lack of earlier in the season at all. Like that looks like a completely different Rutgers defensive line. And I do think that Minnesota is very similar to Maryland in that they have bigger linemen. And so they can be susceptible to either speed rushes or if they try to set to protect against a speed rush, sometimes you can get that bull rush. They're playing a freshman at left tackle. Really, they were expecting Isaiah Wright, former Rutgers transfer to Buffalo and then Maryland, to be a key part of their offensive line. And he was kind of a lower 3-tier prospect when he was at Rutgers and never really saw the field. So that goes to show you that they do value size and that also they're relying on some inexperienced guys at that position. So I do think that the veteran guys on that Rutgers defensive line, especially those that can kind of use speed, a little bit of speed or power, like I think Hamilton is a good game for him. Walker, I think it'll be interesting how they play this because one of the things we talked about that was killing Rutgers was playing that strong side, weak side, where they were constantly shifting who was on what side of the field. And they abandoned that more last week than I've ever seen them do it, where especially on third downs, they were not last second trying to flip-flop what side of the field they were on. And so I think Minnesota was a little bit surprised with that. So Rutgers was able to get better matchups than previous, right? Because it doesn't allow the offense to dictate to you exactly what they want to do. So perhaps you get Walker against that freshman or even Lewis if he can go. I'm not sure which shoulder is bad. I forget to see which side of the field he should be playing on, but that also might protect that shoulder somewhat. And then I do think some of the veterans on the interior, I'm not sure if Rainey was hurt, but between Ray and Rutgers has guys like Griffin had a nice game last week. They have some veteran, even if they don't have as many game reps that are starting prior to this year. I think some of those guys might be able to get into the backfield. I mean, Griffin, we forget, he made that sack right up the gut. I don't even know if that was supposed to be a screen, but he was in the backfield so quickly, it caused a fumble that almost set up Rutgers for a touchdown. Instead, they ended up getting the safety a play or two later. But that was almost a second straight fumble inside the 10-yard line.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think some of those guys might surprise us with their pressure this week just by defeating Maryland's one-on-one blocking. And, do they need to get pressure? Yes. If they're not getting pressure with 4, do they have to blitz? Yes. But I think initially they're going to hope that they can get some pressure without doing that. Because last week they did early on, especially.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's just so key for this defense to start with some momentum and get off to a good start, get a stop on that first drive, and then obviously the offense show they can move the football. Because I think Rutgers, this is a game they need to play ahead on and really kind of, push the will of Maryland in this game. Special teams on paper, pretty even. Neither team returns it a lot. Both kickers are about the same. Punters about the same. Any closing thoughts on special teams and or last thoughts on this matchup?
Rutgers is not going to win this game on special teams probably, but they can't lose it on special teams. That's basically the way I would say it, because they don't have the elite special teams unit we've seen in yesteryear, but I think their punter's been okay. Their kicker's been fine. When they have returned the balls, they've been okay. But this does kind of go to what we've talked about with Maryland in general, because they rely on top end speed and in some cases size. On special teams, they can be vulnerable. They can make mistakes. They did give up a fake punt to Oregon that went for huge yardage. I have no idea what they were doing on that. Basically, the guy was untouched for 20 or something yards. Now, Rutgers doesn't have a guy, I forget his name, but number 1 on Oregon, guy was 6'4", probably ran a 4.5. I don't know what position he was. Almost looked like a defensive end. So Rutgers doesn't have a guy like that to take a ball on a fake punt in such a way. But I do think Maryland at times can be a little bit of a sleep at the wheel. You would think off a bye week, their special teams would be the best they've been all year, and they clearly weren't. So I do think special teams is an area where Rutgers can get a little bit of an edge. If you can make the field that Maryland needs to travel longer, that's good. But I also think that you might get into a scenario where you dare Maryland to throw the ball deep. And you were telling me offline that statistically speaking, Edwards doesn't throw the ball downfield that much relative to his overall pass attempts because he throws so many intermediates. So if you have to, you might have to just dare them to throw it deep on you. I haven't seen a lot of those passes from Edwards because I don't think they've needed to try it. And then when they've been trailing in games, defenses have been kind of backing up. But in a game where Maryland's ahead and you have to kind of get up at field to make sure that Hemby doesn't beat you between the tackles, you might have to just put your corners on an island and then hope they hold up to give yourself a chance to come back. So that's definitely another thing. If Rutgers falls down early, last year when they went to that, they weren't able to stop them. Maryland just kept completing passes deep until they decided to not do it anymore. But I think and then they decided to chew clock last year. But that last year's game, I mean, that could easily happen again. The year before, Rutgers kind of forced 2 turnovers to prevent it from going off the rails, and then it just went completely to trash. So I guess the last thing I'll say about it is we talked about in the preseason, I have very little confidence in Rutgers beating Maryland because in the first 10 years in the conference, they've won 3 times. One in overtime where Maryland had to get called for a targeting penalty in 2020 with no fans in the stands on an interception return that would have sealed the game. 2 in the 2017 game.
With a third-string quarterback.
Right. In 2020. In 2017, with a 4th or 5th string quarterback, Rutgers gave up the tying touchdown, but it was called back for an offensive pass interference. And then in 2014, when they won, they had to make a 25-point comeback.
Yep.
So I hope I'm wrong, but my preseason, I had this as a loss for all of these reasons. And that's not to say Rutgers can't win. I'd say last week I was giving them maybe a 40-45% chance of winning. This week, I think it's probably lower than that, but maybe 1 in 3 they can pull this one out. If Maryland plays bad and Rutgers plays medium or good, I think they win. I think Maryland's floor as a team is actually lower somehow, even though we've seen some pretty low play from Rutgers offense and Rutgers defense at different times. but there's an opportunity in this game. And if you want it more, then that might get kind of more to a 50-50 type of game. And that's what we got to hope for. And then just hope that Rutgers can now coach Maryland, which I historically speaking, I think Loxley knows how to play against teams that play like Schiano, that Minnesota game notwithstanding.
Yeah, I think can Rutgers play with a certain physicality that can help negate that speed a little bit? That's a real question mark, just in terms of their toughness. And yeah, it's been frustrating to see Loxley, win pretty easily against Schiano and the coaching staff the last few years. I do feel like the gap is closed in this game, more so than in years past, in terms of Maryland's being so dynamic on offense, although they could still be really dangerous in this game. So I think if it's close, you give the edge to Rutgers, just in terms of does the Loxley coaching mishap show up in this game where Rutgers can maybe take advantage of it. It's going to be interesting to see, but really huge opportunity, obviously, for this team to become bowl eligible. I think this season's been so much momentum, both good and bad. And although I think this is their worst matchup left on the schedule, if you can win this game, it really gives hope to this team that going into those final two, you can get one of those. And then they were looking at a 7-5 year, which, wouldn't be necessarily where we wanted it to be, but really would change the narrative of where we were even just a week and a half ago with this team. So,
well, I was going to ask you real quick. Do you think that if they can just get to 6 wins, the season would not be considered a failure, correct? Based on everything that happened.
Based on everything that happened, if you get to 6 wins and you get to a bowl game, you essentially held serve, right? So you did take a step backwards. I don't think it's a total failure. I think it can be disappointing that they didn't take a step or two forward, but it's not a failure. Going 4, 5, and 7 and not making a bowl game after last year is a failure.
Especially with 3 chances to do
correct.
it.
Correct. Yeah, no, they gotta get one more win. But I like this. It's very, like, for me, like, if they win this game, then I think, okay, then you got to get to 7, because then you're matched up against 2 teams that you match up better against. Even though Illinois is a good team, I mean, that is a team that Rutgers matches up really well against. And then Michigan State, is a little bit hit or miss. Not quite sure what you get from them week to week, but that is a winnable game. So I think all of a sudden, if you can do that, like that just, it's funny how one win can flip the whole narrative. But if you go 7-5 with everything that happened, we're going to feel a lot better about things than we did, at the bye week, obviously. And it gives them a chance to get 8 wins with that bowl game. So there's a lot on the table still. And we obviously saw the character of this program show up last week. Obviously, physically, they were fresher, they were healthier. Can they replicate that this week against a team that style-wise isn't their best suited for? But, they're going to a Maryland. I mean, there's not going to be a home field advantage. It's a night game. I think it's going to be a wild game. Whether it's a shootout or not remains to be seen, but I think we're going to see some weird stuff.
Yeah, you might have hit on this earlier, but it kind of felt like almost last week, as well as the season as a whole, almost felt like a baseball season in the sense that baseball is all about leverage. About you get yourself in 3rd and short, you got to convert it. Like in baseball, you get an 0-2 count as a pitcher, you can't walk that guy. Like you got to just make that pitch. And then similarly, that was kind of in game. And then from the outside in baseball, they always talk about you got to stack up those wins when you're hot, like we talked about early in the year. But then if you're in a losing streak, you just got to find a way to get one win. Yep. And that was really what happened. And so it was like a microcosm of the season inside of the game of what that kind of was. And I didn't have a lot of confidence going into last week, but I had said preseason that I thought that was the most important game of the year, because regardless of where you were, whether you were underachieving or overachieving, coming out of the bye week, that was the most critical game on schedule. And I guess the last 2 closing comments. One is, speaking of losing streaks, just look at Florida State. I mean, they were inches away from being, inches, basically a committee decision, not even inches away from being in the college football playoff. And now they're 1-9? Yeah. I mean, that just goes to show you, like, if you think we had expectations that were not met, look at them. Yeah. And then, what a difference a year makes. And then the other thing is, I think we undersold, and I tried to harp on this earlier in the year, how many monkeys Rutgers had to get off their backs in this season. Never won at Layton Stadium, did that. They never beat Washington, they did that. They didn't get the ones off Wisconsin, Nebraska, USC, UCLA, kind of new teams, right? And then Minnesota, they never beat Minnesota. They've now beaten Minnesota. So in that stretch of 6 teams they've never beaten, they went 2-4. Plus, if you add the win at Lane Stadium, which they'd never done, I mean, I guess you could say 3-4. And so this Maryland game is not a team they've never beaten, but this is a pretty long losing streak. And so I feel like we undersold like how many kind of gates Rutgers was going to need to pass through to really go through this season of things that, you hear like negativity starting early in the game, like we never beat this team, whatever. So I'm hopeful they can just stay tight early, like you said. And then if this game gets close late, I know Maryland won a very close game against USC when USC completely imploded.
Yep.
But I do think Rutgers is going to be tougher if they can keep it close late, because Maryland's going to be surprised it's even close.
Yep.
Whereas Rutgers is, I think, they're not going to expect to blow out Maryland. So that's one of the other things that happens in East Coast games. I think that happened last week. I think Minnesota was like shocked that they weren't up by 15, 20 points. And they just looked like confused in that game late in the game. And that was not a good look for them. And yet they still only lost by 1 score. So, that's how you got to take it with a grain of salt, right? Like, it's an election losing 51-49. Like, Rutgers won by 1 score. Like, a pick six going the other way and they lose, right? That's how close some of these games are if you can keep them close. But you got to keep them close and give yourself a chance.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to your point about the schedule, I mean, I think we did do a good job of saying, even though, I think people misinterpreted an easy schedule because Michigan, Penn State, Ohio State, those Iowa, Oregon weren't on the schedule, didn't mean it was easy overall. It was easy in the context of what it used to be.
Right.
But, they were projected to be in 9 one-score games, second most in the country. They're now 3-2 in one-score games. We knew there were going to be a lot of toss-up matchup games. There have been. This hopefully will be another one. So we'll see where Rutgers shakes out. But certainly the shaping and the perception of this season is still kind of very moldable here. And this is obviously a huge opportunity for this team to build real momentum in November and clinch bowl eligibility, and really would take a lot of pressure off, I think, these last 2 weeks for this team, which would do a lot of good as well. So David Anderson, thanks so much for being back as always. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much for listening and watching. We'll be back next week, as well as Hoops Friday night playing Monmouth. I'll have a reaction there, as well as after Maryland Saturday night, and be back soon after that. Thanks so much, and go Rutgers.
Thanks.